just introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Sonam Kachru, who has been kind enough to join us today. Dr. Kachru, are you able to hear us clearly?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
So thank you very much for joining us. And I think we've shared a bit of your background, on our posts as well as the communication that we've been sending out before the session. But maybe I can start with, a very brief introduction. So Dr. Sonam Kachru is the assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies, University of Virginia in the USA. He has written several articles on Ashoka as well as Buddhism. In fact, it was one of his articles on Ashoka which caught my attention and motivated me to organize this dialogue. And in that article, he's focused on the difficulty of being good. I think something that all of us encounter at some point in our lives, where we have to choose between what is good and what is convenient or what is profitable, if I may put it that way. So today's session is also, centered around what is Ashoka's image and how can we view it through the lens of Buddhism. So, Dr. Kachru, if I may ask you the first question for today. I mean, you are obviously, of Indian origin. From your name, we can, make that out. And although you've probably been, away from India now for some time, but has your admiration or your twist, if I may call it, with Ashoka, been, as part of your academic training in Buddhism, or has it been there even before that?
Thank you, Ranjit. First, let me say thank you for inviting me. I'm a fan of your work on Ashoka and your podcasts. So it's an absolute delight to be here today. And to everyone, thank you for your attention. No, Ashoka is not an academic interest. Actually, not so in two ways. One, I grew up reading about him through Amar Chitra Katha. So that was I think the first encounter I had with him. And then in history classes in school, we would briefly do a unit where we touched on Ashoka and Buddhism. You did a little bit on the Eightfold Path, and then quickly to the Guptas, and then of course you know the rest, as all of us do. We skip too much and very quickly come to the Mughals and then the English period. But I would say I rediscovered my interest in Ashoka in through circuitous ways. Like sometimes he would show up in the context of Buddhism, sometimes in the context of Indian history, but more intriguingly, he began showing up through the interest of classicists who had begun to be interested in the Northwest and the Greco-Indian period, and that sort of really triggered my interest again. Um, and one of the things that helped is beginning to read Ashoka, and not so much as just a historical marker, but as a thinker, as somebody engaged in a reconceptualization of some of what we will talk about today, of ethics and politics.
Yes. Now, very interesting to know that your interest got triggered through Amar Chitrakatha. I think in India, for a lot of us, that is the starting point in reading history. Not necessarily the textbooks in school, but Amar Chitrakatha with its beautiful graphics. I think everyone uh,
Absolutely.
who's probably born after the 70s or 80s can testify to that. So great to know that. But Doctor, today you probably, we are going to delve a bit more into Ashoka at a cross, at an intersection of Buddhism than so much of, Ashokan history itself. So why don't I give a little context, before my next question, because there are many listeners on the call, and probably I think some context might be in order for some of them at least. So Ashoka, as probably everyone's aware, more so, for a king who let go, of his political ambitions, if I may put it that way, and actually, took the path of pacifism, of, ensuring that his society of his times, led a very moral life, and he did talk about a lot of, what he thought was moral or good to do. Um, but there's also been a lot of interpretation about what happened suddenly, that Ashoka in the 10th or 11th year of his rule suddenly transformed from a very ambitious monarch into someone, who was ready to take an entirely different path of life and also show others, what that path of life meant to him as well. So while there's been many interpretations and some, have been to the extreme of saying that he abdicated his throne and, turned into a monk, there are also the other extremes, where people have interpreted his edicts as populism, as something that, people may be interested in presenting a certain image, much in line with, probably today's politicians. I'm not sure if monarchs needed to be populists to stay, in rule, but that's also been, one extreme of the interpretation. But Ashoka gives himself, some clues to us, and interestingly, through his own edicts. So just for everyone's information here, Ashokan edicts are basically his inscriptions, which have been, written during his time. They are contemporary evidence of not just his existence, but to a great extent, what Indian society may have looked like. And in the very first edict, which is known as the Minor Edict, he talks about having been an Upasak for 2.5 years and having, spent 1 year serving the Sangha. And he uses these terms very specifically, Upasak or Sangha. And he talks about having put in great effort, which he again terms as Parakama. So all of these words in Pali, are very carefully chosen by Ashoka, I'm sure, because it was an official edict. So my second question probably for the day to you is, could you elaborate a bit on why he may have used the term Upasak instead of using something, more direct and simple, like a believer, because he uses the term Bhakta in the fifth edict. He could have used that here as well. Why does he use Upasak? And maybe we can start the discussion with that.
Thank you, Ranjit. That's one that's very erudite. That's absolutely correct what you said, and it's a beautiful question. Sometimes we speak of Buddhism, the Buddhist tradition, as consisting in two sorts of people. One would be full-blown renunciants, so your monks and nuns, and then we use the phrase in English. Sometimes we call them lay people. Right? That's the idea that these are people who are not, let's say, professionally Buddhist in the sense of taking on the full commitment. But the word layperson, I find, and many others have found, is not quite precise as Upasaka, right? For Ashoka to say that he has been an Upasaka is to say something very specific. It is to say that he has taken on an obligation, not only a commitment to the tradition, but an obligation to serve it and perhaps even to embody a certain set of virtues. So there is a debate within the tradition itself. Different Buddhist traditions at different times have understood the ideal of an upasaka, an attendant or somebody who serves the monks and nuns. What does it take to be one? And sometimes it is said you have to take the triple refuge, right? Buddham Sharanam Gacchami and etc. You undertake going to the refuge, to the triple jewels, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. But there are other texts also that have a more demanding criterion, where you take on the Panchashila, right? This disciplinary matrix, where you vow for your entire life to refrain from taking life, to refrain from taking what is not yours, right? You refrain from false speech and so on, up to and including refraining from sexual misconduct and the use of intoxicants. So this is a more demanding criterion. There's an ethical ideal involved, so the two senses of being connected to the Buddhist tradition specifically, this element of service to the monks and nuns in specific monastic complexes, and providing for their upkeep and their practice. And then you are also practicing yourself, and in that sense furthering the tradition and its professed values. So that's something really striking for Ashoka to say. Today we may say somebody's a Buddhist, but it's not always clear what we mean. Do we mean somebody's belief? Like you said, like to be a bhakt, maybe one has just inclination or a certain kind of affective relationship with something. But upasaka is to enter into a discipline, I think, connected up with the tradition and a series of practices. And so that's why it's very nice when he says, well, I've been a upasaka for so long, but for the first sort of time, it was not really,
Yeah.
there was not really oomph in there. There was not really, it was not strong. And then something happens and it quickens and then with certain effects. So I'll stop there for now, but I think it's a lovely question to have asked because, and I think depending on where the conversation goes, whatever else we may say of Ashoka, his personal commitments, and we'll talk about his public persona and the way he articulates a more than personal ethical system, but his personal commitments are very clearly allied with the Buddhist tradition in terms of the Buddhist tradition being the object of his regard, but also as providing the terms and the self-understanding for his own practice. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think the session's getting so interesting. I actually forgot to even run the poll. So why don't I run one poll, which probably gives us an idea of whether people saw this as a black, white, or gray in whatever Ashoka was proposing, and maybe that helps us segue into the next part of the session. See a lot of responses coming in. I would encourage everyone, on the call to participate because I think it gives us a very nice leading indicator of, where people's thoughts are, and then I think we can use that, context for the discussion as well. So, yeah. So I can see that, there are about 58% who think that yes, Ashoka could have played the role of a moral ruler as well as, a powerful emperor at the same time. And then there are some who don't believe it would have been probably practical. And then there are some who are, on the fence who think that it may or may not have been true. What's your view, with regards to his public, communication, which was largely, or it looks like it was largely, driven by the concept of Dhamma as, preached by the Buddha or as taught by the Buddha and preached later. Uh, do you somewhere also think that some scholars do hold an opinion that this was probably a lot of Ashoka's own doing and not necessarily the Buddhist Dhamma that he refers to? uh, do you have a particular view on that?
That's again a very, very interesting question. Um, okay, so if you will permit me, I'll connect my answer on the one hand to this ideal of an upasaka, and then look forward to something Ashoka himself says about how to think about Dhamma in connection with a multitude of traditions. Right? Okay, so if one looks at this matrix, this disciplinary matrix, this Panchashila, the fivefold discipline that you take on as an upasaka, one quickly notices a kind of a basic continuity with other ascetic traditions and also other Brahmanical ascetics at the time. This emphasis on non-harm, for example, and the sense of the importance of speech. This idea that somehow the ways in which we relate to each other are manifested in our patterns of speech. And so this becomes an element of real concern to control for negative influences through emotions or thoughts, intoxication, loss of self-control. I think what Ashoka is doing is realizing that, forgive me, let me try it this way. So if I were to look at the Panchashila, this disciplinary matrix from the point of view, say, of Buddhist monastic philosophy, they would look at it and say, and we have evidence of them, of certain shastras saying this is a preliminary and foundational ethical practice, but on its own, it is insufficient to get you to the goal, which would be like complete freedom from dukkha, whether you call it nirvana or you have other terms for it, there's more that you have to do. We have evidence of people saying things like this, is that the way you make sense of the Panchashila within the Buddhist framework will then require the full framework of Buddhist ethics and commitments. I sometimes think that what Ashoka is doing is looking at it the other direction, as it were, not from the perspective of nirvana, but
Mhm.
taking these ethical principles that are important to Buddhism and that he's learning through Buddhism, maybe, and looking at the whole landscape of Indian religious traditions through the ethical framework and saying, you know what, this is something that we seems to be at the core, in brackets, this is something that should be at the core of all these traditions, these pasandas, right? And insofar as one is putting forward one's tradition as ethically beneficial, there will be this agreement on these principles or these kinds of disciplinary virtues. And he says this in a couple of edicts, right? That when it comes to ethical traditions, they all emphasize inner purity and self-control, right?
Yes.
And so I think of like what he is doing is, it's not so much that it's not Buddhist. It's
Mhm.
clearly very resonant with Buddhism and influenced by Buddhism. But I think what Ashoka is allowing himself to see is the continuities rather than the exceptionalism of Buddhism, and saying, here is something that matters and should matter to all traditions, insofar as there are traditions of ethical fashioning and subject formation.
It's very
So
much in line with, his idea of having respect for all sects, not,
yes,
only, so probably he's trying something more universal. Is that what you're saying, and not
I think
necessarily?
so. I think there's this place in, and there are antecedents in Buddhism, but also in certain other traditions for this recognition that there is an ethical framework that matters and that lies at the basis of the later meditative or philosophical accomplishments. And I like to think of Ashoka as just turning our attention to that framework and saying, if we pay attention here, we will see our differences differently. What will matter is Dhamma, not so much my, and here he uses that word, right? My devotion, my bhakti towards my own tradition is not as important as that my tradition is for the sake of Dhamma, for the sake of the growth of Dhamma. And so I think that use is a kind of an innovation, to see that by Dhamma, I don't have to mean what is unique to my tradition. It can be what is common to all. Um, I don't know. This
Yes.
is this is an
No.
area where experts fear to tread. So I'm also like just going out on a limb. But
No, I think very beautifully explained, and not necessarily, in a very very historical sense. I mean, the bigger debate, I think, like you said yourself, is out there, more, on the historic plane. That was it, Buddhist or not Buddhist, and there are claims on, both sides as to whether that was the truth or not. Of course, there is so much evidence in the edicts, about Ashoka referring to not only the Buddha at least 4 times across all the edicts, but also to several texts.
oh,
I think
yes,
the Vairak edict does talk about certain texts which he recommends to the sangha, in that location, in that region, that they should read these particular texts. So
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So I should say, I don't. So there are some scholars I think who may find these two patterns of emphasis, the private emphasis on being a Buddhist and the emphasis on this common framework, to be in tension. And I see no tension. I think that they can be profoundly aligned. That it's not that Ashoka had to compromise on being Buddhist in order to see pluralism as a virtue, right? There is a sense in which for Ashoka this flows out of being Buddhist, this emphasis on pluralism. These are not in tension. In fact, the argument he offers in the 12th edict is really lovely, because he says being pluralist with respect to other traditions furthers one's own tradition. It benefits one's tradition, and to see this common framework of ethics as mattering to all traditions. And the reverse is true too. To not see that is to harm one's own tradition. So I think there's the sense in which we sometimes think they're in conflict, but in my mind, there's no doubt he was personally like an upasaka, that was not an idle commitment.
Yes. So probably as an upasak, he felt somewhere also compelled to not just kind of, take all the good for himself, but share it with the wider, audience, if I may say, if his subjects, we think of as audience. Right. So, again, going back to the point on, him having referred to the Buddha, maybe we can run a very quick poll just to understand whether, he was really being agnostic, being secular, or being religious in his edicts. Something, that probably has, begged question in the past as well, that he is referring to the Buddha only 4 times. I mean, there are edicts of later kings that not only praise their chosen deities, but also compare themselves to many of the deities. If you look at Samudragupta's edict, we look at many other edicts where they would love to compare themselves to a Vishnu or to a Shiva or to an Indra. But that does not seem to be the case with Ashoka. So uh, is it because he was trying to be agnostic as per his own thoughts on respecting all sects, or was he being more secular in the sense that I would not give probably prominence to faith here, but to what's good in the faith, or was he just being religious? And when I say that, that's my next question. uh, that does Ashoka follow probably something that the sect or the Sangha forbade, which is eulogizing, the Buddha himself, either in word or in image, especially in a human image. Is that probably, why he does not go to the extent of either praising him too much or having, a human form of the Buddha on on the pillars instead of showing a lion capital or an elephant capital. So I think we can look at what people think. The results are there. So I think for most people, it seems he did not want to appear biased towards Buddhism, which is why he did not explicitly refer to the Buddha or praise him enough in his edicts. Some people do believe that Buddhism probably forbade worshipping, and there's another small minority which thinks that he was not a practicing Buddhist. So, which is why he does not refer to the Buddha himself. So all interesting perspectives, I think. Which one would be your pick?
Um, okay, this is complicated. So I first let me say I now understand your question. It's a beautiful question. If I may rephrase it so that I can think about it, is the absence of the Buddha in a way in the major edicts and in the pillars edicts not a sign of the lack of commitment to Buddhism, but continuous with the Buddhist tradition's own investment, say, in the iconographic presentation and not the corporeal presentation of the book. That's actually really striking. I had not thought of that. Um, okay, I have to think about this. This is very lovely because it opens up a number of ways in which the Buddha was thought to be made present in both architectural, art historical, and also narrative ways, and how to think about the Buddha's body, as it were, and his presence. It's a huge subject, and it would be lovely to think of Ashoka in connection with that. Okay, let me go back to the poll though. So I should say, I think it's not accidental that we see signs of his personal profession of commitment as an upasaka in what are called we call the minor edicts. He didn't call them the minor edicts, but we don't see them in the series that we call the major rock edicts or the pillar. I think these are two different kinds of registers of texts. And I think so in this personal communications, and when he's talking to the Sangha, he has no problem speaking in a certain kind of more personal idiom, right? If it was Christian, we'd say confessional idiom. Maybe this is not appropriate. But with these two types of texts that we have now. I like to so following Patrick Olivelle, the scholar, the major scholar of Indian religions and history. I do think he's right. I think we should think of these as carefully crafted anthologies of ethical sayings and opinions, right? And we'd have to look at the persona that Ashoka maintains through these later series or later anthologies of sayings. And I'm not so sure it's quite the case that he does not want to appear biased as much as what he has crafted in these communications is this new sense of Dhamma that is that brackets out the claims and commitments that are peculiar to any one tradition and brings to view what's common. I mean, I think that's the purpose, is to try and get people to see that. And in that context, a personal confession would be out of place. It's not so much that it would be biased or not, but it just, that's not the purpose of those um, edicts. There's a word he says in the 12th, like the growth of what is essential, maybe like the salavadi or vriddhi of what's held in common. And I like to think of these series of ethical inscriptions as having that purpose of training our attention to think in terms of our commonalities rather than our differences. But to your question about, is the Buddha nevertheless present precisely because of his absence, I don't have an answer to that. I think that's gorgeous. I think certainly he is evoked by the symbols of the wheel, the elephant, the deers, right? Like all these. I don't think Ashoka was hiding his evocation, let's say, of the Buddha. And and then there's this large question of how the Buddhist tradition itself presents the Buddha, right? They don't, as you know, and this is the reason why you've asked this question. The Buddha is not depicted for a very long time, except indirectly through either symbols or iconographic imagery, or sometimes, and I owe this to art historians, this is not my knowledge, sometimes by the careful crafting of scenes so that you are shown the missing space where the Buddha should be, and you can even put yourself in the scene and try and explore that absence, that sense of, right, that the center of gravity is precisely what's not here. Um, so maybe that's something going on. I have to think about that there is a sense in what holds all this together is not being mentioned. That I don't know. That's
Yeah,
beautiful.
because the Buddha has been, shown and in the form of a stupa. He have,
Yeah.
been shown in the form of a tree, the Bodhi
Yeah.
tree, and then
Footprint.
much later, he comes in a human, form.
That's
Uh,
right. It's much later.
where probably is where the first time you start seeing the images of the Buddha.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, definitely, a difficult thing to imagine whether he would have done it under the pressure of, a particular doctrine, or whether it was his active choice. But like you said, it's probably him not being there, which really, puts him there in that way
It's a
without being.
very beautiful suggestion. I really need to think about this. That's a really lovely suggestion. And as you say, though, there are these other inscriptions where, I mean, it's not just that he says that he is an Upasaka, the language is saturated with Buddhist references, right? So, or even like he goes on a Dhamma tour for
Yes,
256
true.
days, right? 200 but that's a very Buddhist, and it's seeped in Buddhist mythology, ritual, and institutional significance, right? So I think there is this, yeah, we have to put ourselves back in this world where it was possible to occupy these different stances, the personally full-blown commitment, and then and occupy these registers, but also craft a public idiom, right, where you can allow people to see different things.
Right. I'm seeing some interesting comments, come up in the chat window. Dr. Dalal, very, a renowned and known archaeologist
Cool.
in India. He probably is, making a point there where he says his religion is to rule, and not, to be part of any particular, religion. And probably he was also doing a bit of, a political spin on this, as most of the people then in his area of, dominance at least, were Buddhists. So probably that was one reason as well. Because Ashoka is almost, what, 150, 200 years after the Buddha. So a significant period has passed, Buddhism is anyway on the rise. So that's also a great perspective. Thank you, Dr. Dalal,
Thank you.
for giving that perspective to it as well. Um, Although from the fact that Ashoka talks about respect for other sects, I think that's something to also do with, again, not sort of praising his own sect. And he says that in his edicts, that one should not
Yeah,
necessarily praise his own, or rather, one should also appreciate what's good in the other sect. So I guess his, yeah, that's the right word, Dr. Dal, probably plurality. Very, interesting concept for a king to probably profess in third century BCE. Try and be plural in his approach. Probably a lot that we need today. Uh, let's
absolutely.
go to probably the next poll, and just on the lines of what Dr. Dalal's also put there, let's look at, were Ashoka's, edicts a part of a populist effort on his part as a ruler? Was there just a lot of idealism there, or were those really ideas meant for the welfare of the society at large? Let's see what, people have to say to that. Wow. So let me share the results. I hope we all can see the results. Maybe someone can type in the chat window just to let me know if you can see the poll results every time we're sharing them. So there's a big number here of 69% people who believe that he was actually practicing what he preached, and hence he talks about building roads or digging wells or providing health care, if I may put it that way, in his edicts. Uh, some people believe that these were ideals expected of a Buddhist ruler, and that is why he was trying to project himself as a good Upasak ruler or as a good, Buddhist ruler. And then there's a small number of people who believe that he was only wanting to appear, as a generous and caring ruler. So all again good, perspectives, and probably I'll take the next question using the smallest, group here, which believes that he only wanted to appear as a generous and caring ruler. And I remember, you saying in one of your articles that it's not only important to have a vision for infrastructure, but there has to be a, vision for infrastructure accompanied with, one of goodness or one of, morality. And I think in today's time, if we just switch a bit, from third century to 2021, I think your president, Joe Biden, has committed trillions of dollars to infrastructure. And he's talking about building roads and providing water pipes. So that does look like, infrastructure and the basic needs of people have been, the focus for rulers for over 2,300 years. So if I draw that, parallel and go to, your comment on not just infrastructure, but something, more than that, is that something, you would want to talk about in context of Ashoka as well?
Thank you, Ranjit. Again, a lovely question, um, and I can see Professor Dalal is adding lovely remarks too. And for those present, I would definitely underscore the importance of the Chaimenids. I think Professor is absolutely right. They are very, very important as a precedent for Ashoka, materially, ethically, and politically. Absolutely, the very conception of power And probably the idea of projecting one's ethical self-image through inscriptions like this and projecting the power of the empire through such monuments is Achaemenid in origin. But let me answer your question about the infrastructure. So the point I made, initially it came to me as a metaphor, if I may speak, it sounds like self-aggrandizement, so I apologize. The idea was that along with the public works of welfare, the roads, the digging of wells, the planting of trees to provide shade for animals and humans, remarkable thought. Engineering of ecological spaces to provide medicinal benefits, right, for long-term medicinal use, therapeutic benefits, again, for animals and humans. So that's definitely infrastructural. And we still have examples of Mauryan infrastructure, right, that they find every now and again archaeologically. It's remarkable. But my thought was that these edicts are the ethical vision that they promote and the ideals that they espouse are also part of the infrastructure. And, you know, initially I thought this was a metaphor, but now when I think about it, I don't mean it as a metaphor. I mean, literally, there is this, so infrastructure really means any factors that lie at the foundation or that make possible a certain collective system that makes the functioning of that system possible. So your roads, your whatever your framework has to be there in place for collective life to be possible at a time and over time, so that our next generation will also find this life possible. I think Ashoka may have thought that along with, let's call it physical infrastructure, you need a certain kind of ethical infrastructure that has to be in place if the system is to thrive over time and at a time. I think the pluralism is part of it. I think the ethical, the investment in virtues of self-control, and I think this is the most forward-thinking part of Ashoka's ethical vision, is the emphasis on speech, that the virtues we will need to survive together will manifest and will take the form of virtues of public speech, because that's where our pro-social lives intersect, right, with each other. I think this is, and that includes the pluralism, right, the praise or the blame of one another's traditions, of our identities, how we handle and comport to each other. These are all negotiated through linguistic media. And if I look today, I think one of the things Ashoka would be, I think he would have been the first to point out, is the utter deterioration of our public linguistic ecologies, the worlds in which we interact with each other, the proliferation of falsity, abuse, etc., and so on. And given which, I'm afraid to say, no amount of just physical infrastructural repair will solve the long-term problems we're facing. When I think about the US or I think about India, like India is actually doing better in that sense than the US. In the US, the utter erosion of trust in the government or in science, or the polarization of communities to the extent which they literally occupy different spaces, like hermeneutic spaces, and cannot see past that to dialogue, that is going to spell ruin for us. It's already, we've seen what it's done during the pandemic, right? It's costing lives, and given the very real conditions we're facing, all of us are facing, with climate change, with like, global inequality, I fear that Ashoka was all too right. No amount of physical infrastructure, however necessary, is sufficient. There's this, if I'll say this and then I'll shut up. I'm sorry, I'm talking very long. There's the seventh pillar edict where Ashoka seems to reflect on his own tenure. And he says that so these Dhamma promulgations have been carried out through legislation, but also through a program of internalization through meditation. And then he says something very striking. I don't know what to make of this. Right? He says of these two, the meditation or internalization is more important. And I think this is part of what I mean by the legislation and the infrastructural changes are important, but we also need a program to help make them stick and help people absorb them as something they want to have. And that project is absolutely still something we're struggling with, all of us, I think.
Very beautiful. I think this is something, that is very helpful for us to relate, something that's a part of history as such, with our living as of today. I think that's probably one of the big roles, that history plays in all of our lives, which is connect, to our present and not only be merely stories that we all marvel at, from the past or use, in our public interactions to, show one sect or one community either down, or as inferior. So thank you so much, for that angle, that perspective on public speech particularly. I don't think that has been written about or sort of focused upon as much. And he does repeatedly talk about speech, good speech being one of the key elements to growth, or what he calls parakama. um, so maybe we can just try one more poll to get a sense of what Ashoka was trying to get at when he was talking, he's talked a lot about the environment. I mean, if in today's context, probably it's something we can call environment, but even in his day, probably the killing of animals or, sentient beings had something definitely to do with the environment as well, and not merely, as a religious doctrine of not harming, a sentient being, although of course the latter does appear more difficult for one to justify than justifying for environment. But let's look at a poll just to get a sense of what people think that's happening today. I mean, with the environment, and which of these things probably could help more, and then we'll switch back to in the Ashokan context also look at this question. I'd encourage everyone to try the poll and give your opinion. I think this topic is now, one of the most critical topics, for humanity as such. I was seeing a lovely documentary called Seaspiracy, which is being talked about a lot for its, boldness in showing what's happening to the oceans. And the documentary maker ends, the film by saying, while I have advocated for, environment largely in my documentary, the biggest thing I've learned is it's caring for the sentient life, other sentient beings. That is probably, the more difficult thing for us to accept. So the poll says, most people think it's moral leadership that will help more than, religious beliefs or laws and regulations. Some people, do not have much hope for humanity, I must say, because they're saying none of the above. And that, is a very, very sad sort of situation to be in, where, people are losing hope entirely for the future of sustainability or environment, whatever we may call it, but it eventually ties into, our survival on this planet. Uh, so, so just going back to, Shoka, he talks a lot about not just, not killing animals, but in a sense, I would say material ownership, or this, never-ending demand for material possessions. So he talks about how moderation, in spending on rituals, moderation, in having success or kirti, he calls, just as the only parameter for measuring, how well you've done in life. Uh, and then, of course, he gives a long list of animal species that should not be killed at all, and some on only certain days, etc. So, does this give us something to learn and sort of imbibe uh, as probably an oblique way of addressing this issue than merely looking at laws and regulations today?
I mean, what a beautiful question. And again, Ranjit, I hope your audience will not think I'm just praising you because we're old friends. I'm really astonished at the level of your command over the edicts is extraordinary. I wish I had that knowledge, but I think you're absolutely right. Um, So let me approach your question in a, I don't have the answer to it, but let me offer some preliminary just responses. So we've already in the last question, we talked about how Ashoka himself feels like legislation is necessary but insufficient. So there's a sense, there's a limit to what legislating the norms that you would like to see enacted can do. You can say, okay, in Kandahar, let's not practice the slaughter of animals, but without certain other factors, it's going to be hard to make that stick or to have it become an organic part of the culture of the place, right? If there's a long history that pulls in the other direction. I like to think, and this is where I would be really interested in your audience's perception of this as well. Um, when we today talk about the edicts, first, even the word edicts makes them sound like a certain kind of government communication. Yeah, right? But reading them as you yourself have clearly done, they're you know, he even talks about them almost as if they're kavya, right? Like almost as if this is
Yeah.
literature with a rasa of its own and the repetitions, and they're designed to do something to us. They're designed to evoke and to direct us in certain ways. So I really like your suggestion that there is a way we're being attuned in these communications, in these texts that will eventually, I think, make the legislation seem like the obvious thing to have in place. It's not so much to compel us, it's
Yeah.
more like to redirect us to see something or in a certain way that will allow us to understand from where the norm is coming from and allow us to have the norm express our own being. But what is it that we're seeing? What is it that we're being asked to consider? I like to think of it this way. I'm not sure yet, but I think he, like this communication where he details all the forms of life
Yeah.
and their habitats, and they're actually in the calendric details are also about, you know, when do these creatures spawn, when do they have their young, when it's really moving, and in both in its coordination, I think, of the science of the time and in terms of its aesthetic power to show us something. I think he's showing us that what matters to us is life. It already matters to us. We already possess these feelings of continuity with creatures and with other humans that we sometimes overlook, that they are already part of our moral community. Not just that they live on this planet alongside us, they are connected to us, morally connected to us in ways that should evoke from us certain kinds of responses. Um, and the fact that it does not is probably a failure of how we have been taught to view ourselves and these creatures with whom we live. So it's not just animals we need to see again. We need to regard our elders a certain way, the people of other faiths a certain way, people from maybe other empires that we have viewed a certain way, the poor, the sick. There's that amazing communication where he tells people that we have to rehabilitate prisoners. You know, you have to start thinking of even the people who have been condemned, that they too have families, right? That they are looked upon as somebody that matters to them. So this idea of resituating ourselves in these moral relations is, I'd like to think of it as an ethical, but also an aesthetic project. So I think today the version of it would be these documentaries showing us how
Yeah.
to revision ourselves and our planet and our fellow creatures. But then I think also importantly, to show us what we're doing. Like, look at what we are doing to creatures. I don't think, I think many of us live at an abstraction from the true horror of what is required to produce this, this overwhelming consumption of animal flesh and resources from the environment. We have produced a horror that we are very good at keeping away from us. So like in edicts, like where like Ashoka is talking about the Kalinga War and just really coming to terms with what we have done in war, or when he starts out the major edicts by saying, look at how many animals are slaughtered to feed the royal family. Right? There's a sense in which we're trying to make visible the harm required to, for a certain way of life. So those two have to, we need these two aesthetic and ethical parameters, the cost of maintaining our way of life, and what hangs in the balance, our moral connection with these creatures that matter to us. I think, I don't know if we will be successful, but I agree with you that I do not think we can stress um, the danger enough of the time we are in. We are living at a time when which will probably prove pivotal if we should survive. But let me say one. You said something that Ranjit, that was really like it really resonated with me. You said like the faith in um, the capacity that we will see things correctly, and we can work to fix it. I think this is very crucial for Ashoka. I think one way, to go back to your first question, the thing that Ashoka does that is I like to think is, it is Buddhist, it's connected to Buddhism, but it's distinctive, is that the center of gravity is no longer the renunciant
Mm.
and the direction the renunciant faces. It's the virtues of the person in the world and what hangs in the balance for that person, right? The difference it makes to be Buddhist is here and in our social connections and in our, this is the sphere that matters and where we must place our regard. And I think that is an epical thing, to have these virtues that were once the preserve of ascetics and professional renunciants and philosophers who, in a sense, like pull themselves away from these conditions, and to redirect our attention back and say, let's look at what we're eating, and let's look at our families.
On.
That's, I think,
Yes.
that's what we need.
So just before I go to questions from the audience, I can see some very interesting questions there. I would probably just put one last question from my end. Since you're part of a department for religious studies, um, and of course there's a distinction. It's not that you are sort of promoting religion there, but you are teaching people about various religions and what their philosophies are, in effect. Um, do you see religion playing a role, especially for this last point that we discussed? And I saw a very small number of people think that religion has a role to play in kind of making change happen, whether it's for the environment or, like you said, with regards to public speech. Do you see that role for religion, going forward, or have we kind of passed that bend and now it's something altogether new that gets formed?
Actually, I was very surprised by the poll. I was very interested in the fact that so many chose moral
Leadership.
leadership. I don't know. Honestly, Ranjit, I don't know. I don't know the time we're in anymore. And I think it would be wonderful to see the difference. I think in India, the youth of India and the youth of in America today, I think would pick different answers in a way. And
Oh,
maybe people in I don't know. I have to think about this. And actually, I would love to hear from the audience. I don't know. I don't know what will provide the motivational. Uh, so, if I may speak as a philosopher for a moment, um, the question is again beautiful, because what serves as a justification is distinct from what serves as a motivational reason. And I think there's a way in which professional philosophers have spent too much time worrying about really the logical justification of certain positions, when we should really be spending a lot of time on, or you can call it the real politics of the thing, is how do we actually get people to become motivated enough to take up the virtues and the practices we're going to need if we're to survive, right? And I think that's a beautiful question, and I don't know where that motivational set is going to come from. I Let me just say, whether it's religion or not, I think your audience is absolutely right. Exemplification is going to matter. We're going to have to see people that we already invest in
yeah.
uh, as a way as exemplifying it. And I think that's kind of what the edicts are doing, right? They're saying, here I am trying this. Look, we should
Here
do
I'm
this.
trying to go down from hundreds of animals to two or three in my kitchen
I don't
now.
know, how beautiful is that? No, that's just like I'm saying. One day I will get to know animals, but we're not right now. We're trying, but
Yeah.
that trying, the effort of trying, is very important, and to see that happening. Uh, but I will also say, along with the example, it's probably going to take a complete like a reframing of how we see ourselves, like something almost cosmological has to shift to where we now, whether religion provides that or science or aesthetics, or that's a
Be a
difficult question.
combination of many of these things. Probably religions probably reinterpreted in a different way. Thank you so much. I think fantastic, interaction. I'm loving it, and I'm sure the audience is, loving it as well. I can see a lot of, comments as well. Maybe we can pick a few questions, and I hope you are fine extending by another 10, 15 minutes. So maybe I can take one question, which comes, from Gayatri. She has asked, is the depiction of the Buddha's absent presence, and that's a nice term, pointing to the concept of emptiness? Uh, what does the roaring lion on the lion capital signify?
These are great questions, and Ranjit, I would love to know your thoughts on this too. The Buddha's absent presence, which is really nice. It need not refer to something as doctrinally specific as emptiness. Um, we know this because a number of traditions that are not committed to the specific concept of emptiness also invest in this in making palpable the fact that the Buddha is not is in a way absent, and which makes him, of course, present to our attention. The the important concept, I think, there, well, there are two things at issue. Is what is the connection between the person of the Buddha and the ideal of awakening, right? So one you can track as a concrete thing in space and time, and the other, bodhi, awakening itself, is not something situated in space and time. And very early we find Buddhists dealing with the relationship between the person, Siddhartha Gautama, and Buddha or Dhammakaya, whichever term you want to try and capture, that in virtue of which he was an awakened one. And some traditions even grow up to say things like Siddhartha Gautama was a virtual presence, that he was not real. He was an emanation of the actual reality, which is trans-temporal. Others say, no, 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 that's not quite the case. You're getting it wrong. But everyone will agree that there is a way in which what makes the Buddha a Buddha cannot be exhibited either in speech or in form, in art historically graspable, in artistic form. And it's important to see that, that kind of that the Buddha eludes capture in representational form. What do the lions symbolize? I don't know. What do you think, Ranjit?
Yeah, I think that's a question again, for art historians, but maybe Dr. Dalal has also put a comment saying, why is there a elephant
Yeah,
represented?
Lion of the Sakyas, someone says there. Sorry.
Uh,
I will say lions are royalty and fearlessness, right? So there's a sense of Buddha has also conquered fear. Lions rule their territory. There is a long history of the royal symbolism adapted between Buddhism and kings. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think elephant, is also another symbol used very commonly for the Buddha. In fact, Ashoka in his edicts, I mean, one of his edicts, there's also carving,
Yes.
of an
Yeah.
elephant, finished with a bow. I think he talks about, the white elephant. There is also, in one of the sites in Orissa, an actual elephant projecting from the
Yeah.
stone, the rock, where
That's
the
right.
effects are placed. So I think definitely, there is some connection between this symbolism, and the Buddha. Uh, but there is also obviously the other view that, these were signs of royalty. These were symbols used by other, empires, other kings as well, where lion was a very common symbol. Uh, but there is also a reference in Buddhism to the roar, of the lion. It's quite
That
often the Buddha's, what do you say,
teaching
proclamation or
the
teaching,
roar of the
preaching.
lion.
Isn't
That's
it
right.
compared to the roar of the lion?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. There are even texts called the lion's roar, etc. So, yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, in Dolly. Thank you. Thanks, Monish. So that was one question. I hope Gayatri, got her answer to the concept of emptiness. Uh, there is one more question. One second, I'm just trying to look for. There's a question around Prakrit, whether these edicts are in Prakrit or yes. So Sneha has asked, in his inscriptions, they mentioned only about Buddhism or his work as well, things like war, and are these in Prakrit language. uh, so yeah, I think they are all in Prakrit. In fact, a very beautiful book written by Mina Talim has translated all the edicts from the original stamp pages, as they're called, into Prakrit, into Pali, instead of only looking at the Sanskrit translations.
That's
And
nice.
I think it has also given quite a different meaning to some of the edicts because of that translation. And just to probably, answer a little more to Sneha's question, they are not only in Pali, but interestingly, there are also words from Maharashtri, Shauraseni, Magadhi, which were all Prakrit dialects of the time. And Meena Talim claims that, or rather, she explains, I wouldn't say claim, but explains the how Pali was the lingua franca. I mean, it was not just a minor language, but probably a very widely used language in the subcontinent. Uh, so yes, I think they are in Prakrit language. Anything, Sonam, you may want to add to
Hey,
this
no,
question?
no, no, that was masterful. And also to add, in the Northwest, we find Greek and Aramaic as well, like translations.
And yes, he does mention war-like things. Yeah. In fact, he talks about, in the 13th Rock Edict, he talks about how many people were massacred, in the Kalinga War, how many were deported. And of course, he uses those numbers and those references to express his remorse, his guilt at letting that having, happened. And he also says that, even if 1,000 of this were to happen again, he would be very deeply grieved. So yes, he does talk about his work. He talks about wars. Probably a lot of these things are there in the edicts. I can see Dr. Dalal saying that the guilt was really slow. Uh, I guess what he means is it comes years after the actual event. So the event is put at about the 8th year of his rule by most scholars, whereas the actual edict comes only in his 12th or 13th year. uh, so yes, he did probably react, but then there's also the whole transition of him joining the sangha and going through his training as an upasak. I mean, the whole reason why we are having this session today. So yes, slow but definite guilt. Uh, and I think, yeah, his guilt is not expressed in Orissa, which is also true.
It's true.
I think what they now come to call as the separate rock edicts, separate Kalinga rock edicts. Do you have a view on that, Dr. Kachru, on why not in Orissa?
No, I think it's interesting, but I don't have a settled view yet.
Right. So one question I'll take from Abhijit Dandekar, again, very known and I mean, very good friend, but also very known, archaeologist in India. And, he teaches in the Deccan College. So he's asking, what are your thoughts on the mention of Swarga in the edicts, in the context of Buddhism? And I think in his minor edict itself, he says,
Yes.
you can also attain Swarga Radhe tu, he says. So that's a great question, I think. Where does heaven play a role in all of this?
That's lovely. So, okay, I'll say two things. I think one, it's very important that the fruits or the consequences of acting in accordance with Dhamma and for the sake of Dhamma, it's not it's foregrounded to Svarga rather than with a long background of Nirvana or some specific doctrinal felicity, yeah, either from the Jains or Jivikas or what have you. Svarga is a fairly, it can be a fairly um, what's the word I'm looking for? A common way of speaking. Now here I'm borrowing from the way the Mimamsakas analyze Svarga in the context of exhortations to yajna, right? That it's a guna. It gives you the idea of a quality of the soul like happiness. It's not necessarily a reference to a place. It gives you a generic way of speaking of the motivations for successful activity, to be happy, right? To have some kind of felicity. And I feel like what Ashoka is doing is allowing references to Svarga as a kind of a generic form of felicity to stand in for a common marker of motivations for ethical activity. And again, and this being part of the project, as we might reconstruct it, to craft a Dhamma as a highest common factor ethical framework that people from different traditions can identify with, see themselves in, and maybe uh, go on then to replace with specific theological vocabulary, right, for what exactly Sukha is going to look like. Um, yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute. So I think Dr. Dandekar's added to that view by saying he also uses the word paratra while mentioning attainment of swarga. So is that probably his way of saying beyond this world when he says paratra?
That's a very common dyad, right, in this world and in the next, right? Like atra and paratra and like here and there. And that's found in a number of texts, like to talk about immediate and then consequent felicities. So I think, yeah, that's part, I think that's like entailed by the way one talks about Svarga.
Yeah.
But
So not
I
necessarily.
think it's a thin language, right? It's not thickly described. And I
Yeah.
think so to unpack it, we would have had to add more, and then you'd get in more specific vocabularies. Yes, but I think that here in this world, in the next world, Svarga, these are all part of like a package.
So not necessarily the very, if I may call it that, in the Christian sense, paradise, but more probably often of an end, like you said, uh, goal of goodness probably, or something to that effect.
And beyond kirti, right? Like the sense of beyond these narrow parameters of immediate markers of wealth or trappings of prosperity, right? The sense is like we refocus our attention to less proximate ends or satisfactions.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just looking for any other interesting questions that we could pick. So I would just probably ask people on the call to type in their questions, anything more that they would like us to talk about. Uh, there was one question to that from Sagar. Yeah, so Sagar's asked that why can't Ashoka's ideas or his whole project of edicts uh, be viewed in the same way as we today, view democracy or libertarian way of, life. And the edicts were his official way of growing his kingdom's boundaries. So is that, too far-fetched, or could that also, be one of the reasons why, he went to the extent of publishing his edicts, and his edicts are not found only in the eastern part where his capital was, but interestingly his minor edicts are found in Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. His major rock edicts, as you said, are found in Kandahar, Shahbaz Gadi. There are edicts that are all along, the pillar edicts interestingly are all along the course of the Yamuna, and going all the way up to Nepal. So was this a way of stretching his boundaries, or was it simply sort of sharing the message with his neighbors as well? I think you
That's
answered of that earlier, but if you want to elaborate on that.
yeah. I'm not sure I fully understand the connection with today's talk of democracy, and so I would welcome a little bit more.
Probably I mean, I'm just trying to paraphrase. Maybe what Sagar means is is that, appeasement and populism to kind of, uh, create a certain view, a certain image, or
I see. The way Americans talk about being the world's largest democracy, whatever the hell they keep saying, um, while they have military bases all over the planet. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we will ever know, right? I mean, there is clearly. Um, I mean, he did not disband his army and etc. like that. And clearly, the monumentality of the edicts themselves projects its own story of power. The fact that you can even have the infrastructure to make these available trans-regionally, right? I mean, it's just, it all communicates an image of power. Um, but at the same time, I don't think this would invalidate in some way the sincerity of the communications. But I do think there's an interesting connection between the territoriality and the messages, right? The messages are in a way are mapping a certain domain. They're inviting you to think about the territory as expressing a certain kind of ethos. So not just a geographic unity, but a unity of, like, again, there's no other word, of Dhamma as having this, as marking the ethos, right? So I think if we reread the anthologies of these ethical communications, the major rock edicts and the pillar, and look at the geographic markers, they seem to be sketching out what the domain is and what it means. So it's like, in this domain, there no animals are offered in sacrifice, etc. No festivals are held. So it's like, I think they are sketching out a kind of an ethical identity for this realm that's been carved out through geopolitics. Now, whether it's being done with an ulterior motive or not, that's something for historians and archaeologists and everyone to continue debating, as we should. We should keep debating. But I do think there's something to be learned from taking the ethical message at face value for a bit and seeing what kind of world would result were we to put this in practice. At least as a philosopher, that's the kind of question I'm interested in. Oh, what did you think? I can't hear you. Sorry.
sorry, I was on mute. So just before we close, I think one last question, and I'll probably unmute Dr. Dandekar because he has brought up a question around the sixth major rock edict and the parallel that one could draw between the Arthashastra. Uh, that's again, one of the most interesting questions, right? The Mauryan dynasty, its close connection with Arthashastra, and the sixth major rock edict, which does talk to the administrators in a great way. So I've unmuted Dr. Dandekar. Would you like to talk a bit about the parallels between this particular edict and Arthashastra? Any view you would like to share?
Can you hear me, Ranjit? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'd like to see that, I mean, I don't remember the exact adhikaran of the Arthashastra, but basically the Arthashastra talks about how the king's happiness lies in the happiness of his people, and whatever he does is basically for the people, and it's like a sacrifice that the king performs so that his subjects would attain Swarga, or his subjects would attain happiness. That's the thing Arthashastra says. Now, my point is about the date of the Arthashastra. I mean, many scholars believe that the Arthashastra is at a later period, especially for the people like Michael Willis talk about Arthashastra being of a later period for the mention of corals, which were unknown in 3rd century BC to the North India, because they were mostly found in peninsular India. Now, how do you know, kind of grapple with this discrepancy that at one level you have scholars saying that there are references to later periods in Arthashastra, so it belongs to a later period, whereas you see very striking parallels between Ashokan, especially this particular edict, and certain things mentioned in Arthashastra. So that's my question.
It's a very learned question. Thank you, Professor. Okay, so absolutely, there are places where you find the Ashokan vocabulary, and even at the level of sentences and concerns, showing up in the Artha Shastra or the Grihya Sutras, for example. And our problem with Indian texts of this period is that we are dealing with, we're not so much books, right, as you well know, as traditions, so that these texts have layers and they accrete linguistic, conceptual, and historical layers. And what do we do with this? I think this is one of the important uses, this is not the only use, but it's an important use of the edicts themselves to help us see layers in different textual sources that we otherwise would have a difficulty in dating. I think of the Artha Shastra. I am not a scholar of the Artha Shastra by any means, so this is me piggybacking on other people who work on it. I think it's a massively layered work, that it has like almost like geological strata from different philological periods, of which some of them are, I think, may go back to these Mauryan times, or at least resonate with them. But the Arthashastra is not the only one that does this. The Griya Sutras do this as well. You can suddenly see these layers of interconnection and resonance between all of these genres. The Mahabharata also has levels and passages which resonate with this, and then Buddhist works, Jaina works, etc., etc. So I like to think of them not so much as texts as discourses. So there are clearly at the time discourses connecting kings to the everyday lives of people and their concerns in Svarga. There are discourses connecting kings and festivals and harm, etc., etc. You see what I mean? And what we can do is maybe start collecting what textual genres do we see these concerns cropping up in, and then learning to look at all the texts differently as a result of what commonalities we see. And that's not a great answer, but it's a good question. Sorry.
So again, we go back to commonalities rather than, specifics.
With this period, with this period, it's almost impossible to set up like real markers of directional influences and which is coming before. I mean, these edicts are our first text in a way, right? That we actually can sit and grapple.
Yes. We forget that and also undervalue that this is the first written, evidence that we have. Also written evidence that we've deciphered. Of course, people will say in this valley, script is also there, but we still don't, we can't read it. We don't know what's written there. So great session. Thank you very much, Dr. Kachru, for joining us today. And we hope to have more sessions of this manner. Maybe I can also get a poll on that from everyone as to would that be something that would interest people, more of the same, or anything else, like any different kind of topics. Very happy to organize. I think we should have a session definitely with Dr. Dalal, yourself, Dr. Dandekar. Maybe, that's a format to be thought of.
I was going to say, the next time I would love to be in the audience and learn from your audience. And I mean,
yeah, I think that's the whole idea of, all of us learning from each other. And I think many of us have probably gone back from this session today, or will go back from this session with new perspectives, new ideas around not just the shloka and Buddhism. I would say philosophy in general.
Was the most anyone can ever hope for. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to speak with an audience that has such an intimate connection with the material. It's one of the things I miss most about teaching in the US is the people for whom this is our history, and
yes,
that makes a huge difference. So thank you.
Well. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. Hope to have more sessions like this in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.